So in this talk, I'm going to be exploring how YA writers examine and explore masculinity by focusing on two novels that explore gendered violence and sexual assault. The first is Irish writer Louise O'Neill's Asking for It, which was published in 2015, and that is written from the perspective of a teenage girl. And the second is a novel that comes quite a bit later in 2022. It's written by an English author, Louise Finch, but it was published by an Irish publishing house, Little Island. And it is written from the perspective of a teenage boy. So I'll just start by telling you a little bit about these two novels and the reception that they received. Asking for It was Louise O'Neill's second novel. Her first novel, Only Ever Yours, was published just 1 year before that in 2014. And these two novels were two of the grimmest examinations of sexual violence and of gendered power relations that had been seen in an Irish context of YA. And it received an awful lot of international attention as well as national attention at the time. So both of these novels have received a lot of acclaim. So just as an example of Asking for Its ongoing critical acclaim, it was recently chosen in a list that was published, I think just last month, very recently, in the Irish Times newspaper. It was a list of the top 100 Irish titles of the past 25 years. And Asking that was included in the list, and it was actually the only young adult novel included in this list as well, which is, I suppose, interesting in itself. And you might have noticed when I showed you the image of the other novel, The Eternal Return of Clara Hart, that it was also nominated for awards. It was nominated for the 2023 Carnegie Medal, and that was the first time that an Irish publisher had been shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal. So to tell you a little bit about Asking for It, if you don't know the novel, although not explicitly mentioned in Asking for It, consent is the major concern of the novel. So Emma, who's the 18-year-old protagonist of the novel, her consent or her non-consent to sex is publicly debated after she is sexually assaulted at a party, and the sexual assault is uploaded and shown online. And throughout the novel, Emma feels immense pressure to behave, as she describes, to be a good girl. And this pressure ultimately results in her joining her family and the majority of her community in blaming herself for the rape that has been committed on her, and effectively propagating the lie that she was asking for it. And then published 7 years later, The Eternal Return of Clara Hart is narrated through from the perspective of teenager James Spence. And James, or Spence as he's called in the novel, he witnesses an act of sexual assault at a party one night. And ultimately, the novel sees him confront what he sees as his complicity in the event. So he's forced into this sort of time loop where he has to play out the events that lead up to the party and then the events of that night again and again in sort of different iterations. At first, he believes that if he can stop Clara, the girl who is sexually assaulted and then gets hit by a car and dies, if he can stop her from getting drunk, he can break the chain. So he says at one point in the novel, stop her dying, that has to be the answer. But ultimately, it's not as simple as that for Spence. And what actually breaks the time loop and what stops that repeating and what actually saves Clara is when James Spence, when he confronts not just Anthony, his friend who has committed the sexual assault, not just his bad behavior, but also his own poor behavior. And he works with Mia, who's another girl who he finds out that Anthony had previously raped before this party. He works with Mia to make posters of the group chat that you can see here. And they publicly disseminate this group chat, the group chat which you see here, where they rate the girls and they speak about them in derogatory and also potentially violent ways. And then by sharing the posters they share them with a hashtag that says "shame on us" and hashtag "toxic town," the posters take off and they get a lot of attention. So as he says, not in a viral way, but people begin to pay attention, teachers, students. It's a start. And Spence ultimately publicly admits then that he was wrong to engage in this behaviour. He confronts his guilt, and the end of the novel sees him reject a sort of image of masculinity that he'd been trying to live up to, or that he was in a way performing. And that again is a similarity between the way that Emma feels she performs femininity in asking for it. So both of these novels call attention to sexual assault by depicting a specific kind of masculinity, which can be described as laddishness. So you can see here in the second quote that the idea of laddishness or lad culture was connected in sort of early discussions about it to university students and to the context of sport, drinking. And this was certainly the case in Ireland around the time that O'Neill was writing Asking for It. And that novel particularly depicts laddism or lad culture as a problematic form of masculinity, but it doesn't just confine it to sport or alcohol consumption, although those two things play a part. It widens it out to be a problematic aspect of an entire society and culture. So the concept of lad culture and laddishness has been written about widely in popular and academic contexts. And these aspects of masculinity have been framed by critics like Kate Harding as contributing to how what she would see as a cultivation of a culture of rape, which is upheld and organized by men in Western society. And then other critics advocate for a theoretical reframing around lad culture and rape culture that would include a more intersectional and context-specific analysis. So one example is Kitty Nichols's article in the Journal of Gender Studies, where Nichols talks about moving beyond ideas of laddism and interrogates what she sees as a sort of totalizing nature of the category of laddism. So in the talk today, I am questioning, looking at these two novels and thinking about whether the depictions of lads and laddish conduct in these novels oversimplifies the extent and force of patriarchy as this sort of universal system of oppression, and questioning also then, you know, how far do these texts maybe challenge certain normative beliefs about traditional masculinity? How much do they explore how societal expectations to do with gender affect boys? And how much do they present a male perspective in these novels, which are about masculinity? So just to say a little bit about the two pieces of research that the talk sort of comes out of. It comes from two separate pieces. And the first is my monograph, which focused, which is a few years ago now, 2023, and that focused mainly on Louise O'Neill, but there was also sort of a scoping of the field of Irish young adult literature in relation to how it was dealing with issues and debates around consent and issues and debates around the idea of a culture of rape. And then the second one is I don't have a picture for that because it's still in train, but it's a chapter that I've written with my colleague Keith O'Sullivan in DCU, and it looks at the Irish young adult novel from the period between sort of 1990s to right up to today in relation to its engagement with genders and sexualities. And so, lots of people here will know who've engaged in sort of a broad kind of scoping of a field of literature. It allows you to identify patterns. So one of the first patterns that we found in looking at this sort of broad range of Irish young adult literature was that we could see that there was, in that period, there was a domination of Irish women writers. They were increasingly dominating the field of Irish YA. And another observation was that in the mid to late 2000s, very few Irish young adult texts were offering complex or nuanced depictions of straight or cis adolescent men or male characters, especially in the role of protagonists. So I suppose I became interested then in thinking about maybe what were the connections between these two things, particularly in the context of texts that are about sexual violence and about masculinity. And I should say as well, I suppose, that in this sort of chapter about the Irish young adult novel at that time, we thought about, we included Irish writers living in Ireland, Irish writers maybe written, Irish writers who've maybe born in Ireland but living abroad, non-Irish writers living in Ireland, non-Irish writers published by Irish publishing houses and writing about Ireland, which is, I suppose, how we include then Louise Finch's novel. So in terms of that domination of women writers, Louise O'Neill wrote Asking for It in an era of Irish young adult fiction dominated by women. And it's an era that continues today, and one that's evident, across literature more broadly in Ireland as well. And like Louise O'Neill, other Irish women writers, some of whose works you can see here, like Deirdre Sullivan, Sarah Maria Griffin, those writers were putting front and centre their desire, or their agenda even, to prioritise the voices of women and to explicitly politicise writing in order to challenge institutional and cultural violence, particularly sexual violence. And doing so, I suppose, in the hopes of providing young readers with role models that might be suggestive of a new sort of hoped for future. And this dominance of women writers in Ireland at the time is connected to cultural movements more broadly in Irish culture. So the image that you can see there is of hashtag Waking the Feminists, which was a campaign in 2015, 2016, which responded to Ireland's National Theatre, the Abbey Theatre, their plans to produce an entirely male-authored programme of plays as part of the centenary celebration, Waking the Nation. And so novels published, around the same time as this, like O'Neill's Asking for It and Only Ever Yours as well, they're part of a larger enterprise across Irish literary and cultural domains to bring similar issues of gender inequity to light. And this all happened at the time when Irish young adult writing was experiencing quite an intense rise in the mid to late 2000s. And it was a quite important part of its evolution from what had been really quite a limited publishing category in the 1990s, and one which was quite reticent to engage with issues of sexuality or indeed gender, and to then becoming something, a politically charged tradition with quite a distinctive voice of its own then in the 2020s. And this rise was happening, in tandem with a huge amount of cultural and social reform in Ireland around bodily autonomy, and in tandem with international campaigns like the Me Too movement that brought amplified international attention to sexual assault and abuse against women. So the two texts that I'm looking at are examples of how contemporary Irish young adult fiction has become increasingly unafraid to address starker, darker aspects, more problematic discourses around sex. And of course, there's much to be celebrated in that, but there's also, both of the texts also warrant criticism, particularly concerning their handling of laddishness and masculinity. So I'll talk a little bit about asking for it first, and then move on to the eternal return of Clara Hart. So in O'Neill's novel, the laddish behaviour is directly linked to the argument that the text makes for the existence of a rape culture in Ireland. And with this novel, O'Neill holds Ireland accountable for facilitating what she presents as a culture of rape. And that is a culture within which sexism and violence against women are normalised and misogyny is internalised. And you can see in some of the descriptions here, the descriptions of boys' actions in asking for it are overwhelmingly aggressive. Even non-sexual interactions are overly dominant and forceful. And this results in the perception of a sexual double standard being overstated. So violence in the novel is recast as sex, which provides limited roles for both young men and young women. Young men are, presented as permanently sexually alert and hostile, and young women are sexually restricted and submissive. So the text depicts quite limiting ideas about violence and domination as being inherent to masculinity, and it also counterproductively confirms traditional stereotypes to do with girls' vulnerability. So, for example, Emma, when she's thinking about sex and her sexual urges, she thinks about them as something that she needs to keep under control. And her insecurities, they sort of stop her from enjoying sex. So the sexuality of Emma and the majority of girls in the novel is so regulated that the novel runs the risk of erasing the possibility for girls' sexual desire and sexual agency. And this is, of course, because O'Neill's primary concern with this novel is to present the female body as a locus of morality and as a locus of shame. And there are very clear parallels between O'Neill's novel and what other Irish women writers were sort of seeking to do at the time that this novel was published, and rape culture theory as a feminist project. So both of them have a shared mission regarding their attention to women's rights and gender-based violence, and they both have ultimately an emancipatory agenda, and are sort of built on a reformist energy coming out of movements like the Me Too movement and other more national movements that I mentioned. And the critics who contend that a rape culture exists do so with the intention to promote egalitarian relationships between men and women and to empower women. But within the concept of rape culture, there's this lurking potential for extremism, and there's this sort of double-sided energy and aspect to it that we see in asking for it as well. So you can see, a very direct relationship between the two in the fact that Asking for It, O'Neill's novel, was published the same year as Kate Harding's study on gendered violence in 2015 as well. And in that book, Kate Harding says that rape is a defining characteristic of the entire people or society it refers to. And Harding also says that every American boy is at risk of growing up a rapist. And this is the same sort of totalizing, uncompromising view that we see in O'Neill's Asking for It. And ultimately, the depiction of Ireland as a rape culture that we see in that novel essentializes men as violent and women as inherently vulnerable to violence in far too a simple or extreme a manner. But having said that, there are some aspects of nuance in this novel. So the emphasis is very staunchly on girls as disadvantaged, but there are some moments where we can conclude that the boys in the text feel some pressure to relate to these sort of stereotypical constructions of masculinity. So, for example, at one point it's inferred that Eli, who is Emma's friend, Maggie's boyfriend, it's inferred that he may feel a little bit of pressure not to interfere when Emma is sexually assaulted. But however, the reader is also aware that Eli is not drinking like the other boys or the majority of other teenagers at the party. We know this because he's taken away one of the other boys' car keys to prevent, possibly a drunken accident. And I suppose this knowledge that we have as a reader means that he cannot be excused, for not protecting Emma or calling out his friend's behavior. It actually makes his actions all the worse. So this really, the text suggests that Eli, like the majority of the boys in this text, are adhering to this sort of bro club, laddish mentality by not stepping in. There are other moments of nuance as well, where one of the boys is described as looking queasy, suggesting that maybe he considers interceding, or maybe he's grappling with his awareness of Emma's non-consent. He's also the only boy who doesn't touch Emma. But overall, these subtleties and moments of nuance are not developed enough in order to really offer a significant examination of the boys' accounts in the novel. And the novel was adapted into a play in 2018, which was performed in Ireland's National Theatre. And the nuance that is there in O'Neill's novel is actually more evident in the play adaptation than the original text. So the adaptation touches a little bit more on how the boys feel pressured around sort of expectations of manliness and sexual experience. So at one point, Connor mentions that Paul O'Brien, who's one of the older boys who sexually assaults Emma, he mentions that he sees Paul O'Brien every night at the gym, which I suppose hints at maybe young men feeling pressured to attain a certain kind of physique. And in part of the scene that you can see depicted on stage there, the boys talk with a lot of bravado and machismo about their sexual experience. And at one point, Eli mocks Sean, saying that he shit himself during sex. And when Connor tries to intervene and defend him, saying, "I've never heard that story before," one of the other boys, Sean, says, "That's not saying a lot. You haven't heard of much." So the others then laugh at Connor's lack of experience, making him blush in embarrassment. And these aspects of the play script do suggest the social pressure on boys to behave as though they're very sexually experienced, or perhaps even behave in a sexually aggressive or a violent way. But that was a lot less evident in terms of nuance or complexity in the way the play was performed. And again, it was a lost opportunity to explore some of the nuance more. And the play, the production also produced an education pack. And remarkably, in the education pack, there were no responses from young adult boys, only girls. So again, a sort of a missed opportunity there. And thinking of the novel again, the lack of complexity afforded to male characters in the novel, it may be in part because the story is depicted, written from the perspective of Emma, but it's also, I think very likely that it comes from O'Neill's keenness to prioritize the perspective of women and girls. And as I said, that's something she was not alone in doing in terms of other Irish women writers at the time. And I think given the context in which it was written, the novel's keenness to prioritize the experiences of women and girls was part of why it was largely, far more celebrated than critiqued. And so in the chapter that I've co-written with my colleague Keith O'Sullivan, because we were looking back towards the 1990s and then thinking about what's happening today and what has changed and what hasn't, we found that I suppose perhaps unsurprisingly, although consent, sexual violence, they're not taboo topics, they're not underexplored in Irish young adult the young adult novel, but they do remain topics that men writers seem to be sort of wary to explore. Now, whether or not that's part of this sort of corollary of the dominance of women writers, we did really observe that there is this lack or dearth of complex depictions of straight or cis adolescent male and men characters in the role of protagonist in the mid to late 2000s. But that's not to say that, you know, there are no novels dealing that have, you know, complex or sophisticated male characters, even in the role of protagonists. And I'll mention just a couple of novels at the very end if I have time. But just to touch on a few from the 1990s and think about maybe some of the reasons behind why we have that dearth today. So when you look back to the 90s at Irish YA and early 2000s, you'll see that many writers, men and women writers, wrote from the perspective outside of their publicly perceived gender and sexual orientation. So one example is Margaret Cruikshank, Scottish writer living in Ireland. And her novels were written from the perspective of teenage boys, like The Door, which explores sexism, sexual harassment, and political correctness in a very interesting way that sort of you don't see as much today. And the dominance of Irish women writers writing for writing young adult literature for young women might be due to the changing relationship that writers and texts, between writers and texts today. So The Door is an example of, as I said, lots of others from that time where writers were writing outside of their experience. Larry O'Loughlin's Breaking the Silence is an example of a text where Irish young adult literature was dealing with sexual assault and rape earlier than novels like Asking for It. But I suppose we looked at how that changing relationship between writers and texts may have made certain writers more reticent to write about certain things today. So maybe movements like Own Voices, which champions the rights of marginalized writers to tell their stories, and the role of sensitivity readers as well, which seems to be the purpose of which, I suppose, among other things, seems to be to safeguard publishers in some ways from claims of appropriation on the part of writers. And these things combined, I think, have made it important, maybe if not necessary, that writers today identify whether or not they share the marginalized or diverse characteristics with those that they write about. And this has potentially had an effect on a dearth of Irish YA text in recent years that offer sophisticated or complex depictions of straight or cis adolescent males and men characters. But I'm going to move on to talk about Louise Finch's in that context. So Finch's novel, as I said, is published in 2022, and it marks a departure in Irish young adult fiction from texts that deal with sexual assault and violence from the perspective of a teenage girl, or Larry O'Loughlin's text that came earlier is a text about sexual assault, but it's in the context of a boy who's the victim of sexual assault carried out by another boy. And this novel is narrated from teenager James Spence's perspective. So at the party, James walks in on his friend Anthony and Worm in a bedroom with Clara. And James describes this girl as wrecked, which a term that in Ireland means very, very drunk. And he is forced to acknowledge to himself that things went wrong far before this tragedy. He realizes that earlier that evening when before the tragedy of Clara dying, was after she's sexually assaulted, she runs out of the house and she's hit by a car. But he realizes that her dying isn't, the ultimate tragedy. It's what happened beforehand, and he realizes that he had a part to play because he didn't intervene when he saw something, that he knew was wrong happening in the bedroom. And realizing that what happened at the party to Clara is not an isolated incident, James Spence then goes to talk to Mia, this other girl who he kind of thinks something might have happened to, and he asks her about how Anthony sometimes takes things too far with girls. And then he comes to understand that Anthony raped Mia. And you can see in this excerpt here that his self-reflection, he's wondering, was he there in his mind as well? Was he there egging him on? Now, regardless of point of view, a novel is capable of nuanced characterization, of representation. But I suppose by situating a male teenage protagonist at the center of a novel that's about sexual assault and about masculinity, it allows writers like Finch to explore those topics with in a way, I suppose, that Irish readers of young adult literature don't often get to encounter, or maybe haven't encountered at all before. And this novel does attend to nuances in power relations and nuances around the complexities of how consent can be understood or could be misunderstood in ways that we didn't see in previous novels, like Louise O'Neill's Asking for It. The notion that James Spence is there in Anthony's mind, egging him on when he rapes Mia, that potentially raises the notion that consent may have been misunderstood by Anthony. And it also suggests that maybe his behavior is bound up with maybe feeling pressured to act a certain way in sexual encounters. And in this, the novel does go some way in interrogating how laddish behaviors might negatively impact boys. The character of Worm, another friend, is also it also adds nuance to the novel. So Worm, who was involved with Anthony the first time that Clara is sexually assaulted, is not involved in any version of the night that plays out in this time loop after that. So there's complexity afforded to Worm as a character there, and that kind of complexity plays out in other ways in the novel as well. So, for example, James Spence is sort of, through conversations that he has with Clara, he comes to realize that what he thought was maybe flirtatious behavior was misinterpreted by her, and equally she misinterpreted how he behaved as well. So in this way, Finch engages with some of the grey areas around how teenage expressions of sexuality can be misunderstood and understood. But overall, however, the notion that James is there in Anthony's mind, egging him on when he rapes Mia, ultimately depicts masculinity as a collective, and it conflates the act of rape with laddish behavior and with the use of sexist or misogynistic language. And although the protagonist, James Spence, is a complex character, and we see a little bit of nuance in Worm's character, Anthony, the rapist in this novel, is largely underdeveloped. There's, apart from some little suggestions about sort of parental neglect, learned objectified behavior from his father, he's largely very underdeveloped. And at the end of the novel, Clara makes a statement that I think is interesting. She says, "I think there's a real risk that no girls here are ever going to believe that any guys are okay again." And this struck me as a very interesting it's very near to the end of the novel, a very interesting statement that I wonder, does it speak in some way directly to the author's concerns with what is likely to be a majority female readership? So overall, although it does have more complexity than earlier novels that deal with consent, masculinity, and sexual violence, like Asking for It, The Eternal Return of Clara Hart still largely presents masculinity as a problem. It aligns with toxicity, and this ascribes to ideas of men as universally empowered. So since the publication of Asking For It, and I mean, it is really quite remarkable that the attention that Louise O'Neill brought to the issue of consent in Ireland, given that it was nearly 10 years before consent was actually defined in Ireland. We had a big campaign in 2023 called the We Consent campaign, which was Ireland's first national campaign about consent, just in 2023. So the attention that she brought to bear on the need to discuss these issues was really remarkable. However, the fact that consent has only that it has been defined, but more importantly, the fact that it is continually defined is important, I think, in terms of how, well, it speaks to how it is such a complex topic, and it speaks to how I think it ought to be engaged with complexity. So I think, while I acknowledge the achievements of a writer like O'Neill in terms of drawing attention to the topic of sexual assault and consent, the fact that the complexities are missing in this novel, it means that there was a missed opportunity to really develop the kind of critical conversation that could have been developed in terms of creating empathy or healing. And instead, it has the potential to aggravate gendered division. And so I imagine that probably many of you will be familiar with the Netflix show Adolescent. It's a British show that kind of caught the zeitgeist in a similar way, I feel, to Louise O'Neill's Asking For It. It's a show about a 13-year-old boy who's accused of murdering a classmate. And it explores the reasons behind this violence and how the internet affects sort of boys' navigation of masculinity and the very negative effects of that. And the responses to Adolescents really remind me of the responses on social media to when Asking For It was published. So you can see in those tweets there that when Asking For It was published, it was received as this, very long-awaited examination of a very important topic. And there was tweets like this one saying that it should be shown in schools are very similar to the kind of reaction to Adolescents, which was a largely uncritical recommendation that adolescence be shown to teenagers as education. And so, I suppose while it might make sense to have novels and shows that explore masculinity in relation to sexual violence shown in schools, there ought to be more critical examination of these texts. And Niall Gooch, writing for Unheard, in response to the UK government's proposal to show adolescence to teachers in the UK, to teenagers in the UK, and to provide anti-misogyny lessons, Niall Gooch said that well-meaning moralism and lectures are not the answer. And he adds that it is surely much better to understand, appreciate, and unleash the real masculine virtues, and to re-examine our dogmas about how men should embody them. So, I mean, the critical conversation that O'Neill started is an important one in Irish young adult literature. I think it's one that's being continued by writers like Louise Finch with The Eternal Return of Clara Hart. It's ongoing in wider fiction and culture. And I mentioned, just to finish, I mentioned earlier that there was an education pack published with the stage version of Asking For It. And it didn't include young men in the conversation. And I just wanted to show you an example of a recent program that I think is important in terms of a sort of a paradigm shift maybe that is needed in terms of one that moves away from talking about or from framing boys' problems as a sort of crisis of masculinity, and one that moves towards connection and understanding and including boys in the conversation. And that's this program. It's called the Boys in the Making program from last year, and it's done through the Ireland's National College of Art and Design. And my colleague here at DCU, Dr. Debbie Ging, describes it as an inspiring example of how boys can be included in the conversation and given agency precisely through connection around their anxieties, challenges, and vulnerabilities. And I suppose, you know, you might look at that and say, well, that's disconnected to young adult literature, but actually I think you can't really separate it in a way from popular culture, not in a way you can't, from popular culture, from political context, from social context. These texts are so bound up with it. But I suppose seeing a program like this, I think, suggests that in the future we will see more YA texts that do offer more complexity around how they deal with masculinity. And so I said at the beginning that I would just show you briefly a couple of examples of Irish YA writers who I think are particularly strong on writing straight or cis young male characters. Helena Close is a Limerick writer who writes from the perspective of young cis male characters, and again, who's unusual in doing that in the context of most women writers writing from the perspective of teenage girls. And her work it's also interesting more broadly in relation to masculinities because she depicts single parent families headed by fathers in quite positive terms, which is actually, you know, a bit of a departure in the context of Irish young adult literature, where you would have had a lot of depictions of fathers who dealt with grief, as the fathers do in Helena Close's novel, through things like violence or alcoholism. So she's a writer who renders fathers with sensitivity and complexity. And then Kelly McCaughrean is a Northern Irish writer. That's a very recent novel just published last year and nominated for a Children's Books Ireland Award. And that is about two 16-year-old teenagers, Mel and Sid, who get pregnant on the first time they have sex. And it's written from the perspective of both, alternating back and forth. And it's an interesting novel because it represents a version of teenage fatherhood that Irish young adult readers have not encountered before. So Sid is a young man who, you know, not only acknowledges his responsibility, but he also actively embraces it. So they're not texts that deal with sexual assault, but they are about masculinity. And I think in terms of conclusions, I would say that I think Irish young adult literature still has some way to go in more fully exploring how gender conventions to do with masculinity or laddism affect boys. But I do think that works like these suggest, you know, exciting new writing for young adults, representing some previously underrepresented voices and perspectives around masculinity will come to the fore in coming years. Okay, well, thank you very, very much for your attention through that. There's just some of the works that I referred to, so I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, okay, I think I've stopped sharing.
Yes, now, okay, now you have stopped sharing. Yes. Thank you for this fantastic and very important talk. And I'm very much interested in what you have talked about. I have published a book on masculinity and boyhood, but the book was in Polish. So so what you have talked about, you know, boyhood also made me think of Michael Kimmel's Guyland and you know the culture of guys, dudes in the American context. So really, it's I have read just a few of the books that you've mentioned, but I'm looking forward to reading all of the other recommendations. So you're really good at recommending books. so I'm looking forward to reading them. So I'm pretty sure that there will be questions because your talk was so thought-provoking and so complex, and you have used not only literary examples but also examples taken from popular culture, which is also something that I really always appreciate. I think that we should keep on showing the links, the entanglements, between literature and popular culture. So I think that we already have a question in the chat from Alison Baker. There was an article in the bookseller about the death of YA novels in the UK for boys. Is there a bit of a vicious circle about books aren't published for boys and then boys don't read them? Then publishing companies don't publish them, etc.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much. I must check that article about the death of publishing. The point about books published for boys and then boys don't read them is interesting, I think, in relation to that's something I'm interested with these novels, because there's so much about masculinity, but yet are boys reading them? Are boys being included in, would boys want to read them in some ways? Because not just because I think they may be pushed out in a certain way because the text speak to such sort of simplistic binaries in a sense. Yes, and I think it's an interesting question of whether in some ways writers are sort of writing into the void a bit. And I'm reminded of something that one of the writers I mentioned, Sarah Maria Griffin, who's also a women writer who was writing at the time and dealt with similar issues around sexual assault and historical violence. She said at one point that she was talking about the campaign against sexual violence and around bodily autonomy in Ireland, and talked about how it could be an echo chamber because it's only speaking to the people who are already sort of invested in it. And I think, in a sense, some of the concerns that we see across Irish women writers' texts, maybe it also functions a little bit as an echo chamber, in that it's a little bit exclusionary, perhaps. So yes, I think there's a real, I suppose, just because of the nature of the work that I've been doing, that it sort of allows you to look at these patterns. And we also, in DCU University where I work, we're lucky enough to have an arrangement with Children's Books Ireland, who are, they have an award every year, and they give us the collection of the nominated books each year. So it's a fantastic archive because it's living, and it's growing all the time. And it allows us to really kind of see a snapshot of, I suppose, Irishness, all the different aspects that we can look at. But it is certainly something that we have seen that there has been a bit of an echo chamber, there has been a bit of an exclusion. But like I said, I think there are a lot of other writers coming through where there's more interesting or exciting things happening in terms of masculinity. So people like Helena Close and some others. So yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really interesting in terms of books, books being written for a certain type of reader, the type sort of implied reader. And I do wonder, with that line that I mentioned at the end, but from Clara Hart about, girls will think there's no good guys out there at all. I wonder, is it the writer sort of catching herself going, So there is a sense, I suppose, that the type of implied reader that's there, although they're sort of trying to suggest that they're trying to reach and almost teach boy readers, I'm not sure that they are the implied reader in a sense at all. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of tension and gap, I think, that's there. Not just in Irish YA, I suppose, obviously in like
for sure,
in British and other international contexts as well.
Mm-hmm. A good point. Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you, Alison, for this fantastic question. Do we have more questions? I'm pretty sure that there will be some more questions. So we're still waiting. You can remember that you can raise your digital hand if you don't feel like writing your question in the chat, and if you don't feel like raising your digital hand, you can also use our chat function. Yeah, I was thinking about, so while we were waiting for some more questions, I was thinking about some of these books in the category of YA literature and YA fiction. Quite often in various international contexts, books featuring such graphic, let's say, or explicit scenes, graphic descriptions of sex, rape, and so on, are either challenged or banned, or they're classified as adult literature, even though they're clearly, YA. What is the situation like in Ireland? Is it difficult for authors and for publishers to reach, young adult readers? Are there any groups of concerned parents or educators, let's say, who prevent young people from reading such books, from having access, to such texts due to the language used in them or the graphic descriptions?
Yes, I mean, there have been, I remember recently, I think it was last year, a librarian saying that was like she went to bed in Dublin and woke up in California, was what she had said, because there was picketing and things like that outside the library around certain access to certain texts. And I think the point that you made as well about that idea of whether it's adult or young adult is definitely something very relevant to Louise O'Neill, who, like, even the fact that her novel is listed in that 25 books list, it's the only young adult novel, and it was certainly received as a novel that was adult, that wasn't actually a YA novel as we had seen, as people understood it. And there was actually quite a flawed misconception of what young adult literature is, I suppose, in the conversation around that novel, because a lot of the discussion was that she had that it was actually adult, and this was she'd moved beyond sort of young adult writing with it. So there's I suppose a sense that it was the first, as I said, it was one of the most grim examinations that we had seen in Ireland. And because of that, it was, I think, received as particularly adult, but particularly new as well, something new in Ireland where it actually wasn't. We did have novels that did deal in quite stark and frank ways with issues of sexual assault and abuse before that, but I suppose O'Neill's really caught the zeitgeist in a way, that others hadn't before, again, because of how closely enmeshed it was with, popular culture and debates and ideas at the time. So, yeah.
In a way, it reminds me of Sapphire's Push, which was also published as a YA novel, but then it became one of the most frequently challenged books, and I think that because of the film adaptation, Precious, most people did not even consider it a YA novel nowadays, but in the 90s it was published as a YA novel. So once again, also a book about abuse, sexual abuse, rape, and so on. So completely different context, of course, but
it's interesting, isn't it? And yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's something that I've really enjoyed doing in this research is looking back to texts, looking back at texts from the 90s. And there were some of the novels that we looked at as well that were published first as adult and then became YA. So of course it's all bound up with how conceptions of what adolescence is and what, what's appropriate have changed. And something else that I find interesting is looking at how criticism around how consent is dealt with has changed as well. So I find it quite interesting at the moment, like you mentioned, that novel from the 90s, a text that I often think of, which is a sort of a seminal text dealing with sexual assault, is Speak, Laurie Halse Anderson's Speak from the 90s.
Yes,
and that text there's so much criticism around how that text deals with the sort of no means no model of consent, because she, in that text, Miranda, it's all about her finding her voice, and that she screams no, and then ultimately a sort of group of women, her friends, also collectively come and shout no, and that stops Andy, who's the perpetrator, from sexually assaulting her again. And it sort of speaks to a collective empowerment of women and girls. But there was a lot of criticism about how that no means no model of consent maybe aligns someone saying no too closely with recovery, or speaking about it with recovery, so that there's more complexity perhaps around consent and how it works. That seems to be the basis for that criticism. But something that I noticed today in terms of criticism, and there is more now, I think, there's obviously loads written about sex in YA, there's loads written about gendered identity, and there's more and more around consent. But something that I notice is that there's not a lot of criticism about the yes means yes model of consent. And there seems to be sort of an assumption that it's progressive. Like I've even seen something that I thought was very interesting in terms of how the consent being understood without speech is a cultural myth. And actually, I was thinking, but surely there should be more critical engagement around consent being complex and possible without speech, and dynamic, that it can change. So there seems to be so much emphasis in text today around the yes means yes. And we see that in the eternal return of Clara Hart. So for example, James Spence, when he kisses Clara, he says to her, "Is this okay?" So it's kind of that he's developed an understanding around that. And while I'm, obviously that's a good thing, but I think it's an interesting thing that I think that maybe a lot of YA that deals with consent is actually maybe it harks back to older YA's focus on sort of negative dimensions of sex and consequences around good and bad decisions in quite simple, moralistic, didactic ways. And I think there's interesting work that could be done around how scholarship also, tends to look at that as that consent should be completely unproblematic, maybe. And I think what will happen is, in future years, maybe we'll see the same sort of thing that happened with Speak coming to the fore, that we'll see more criticism around, the sort of yes means yes model. And so yes, so I mean, that's all that was a bit of an amble off, but that's the kind of thing with this kind of work that I really enjoy, that you can look back not just at what's happening in the text, but you can also look back at how the scholarship around these topics is changing and evolving, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. It's fascinating. And I also think that rereading old books, or books published in the 80s or 90s, and just trying to position them within present day discourses can be so much fun, and can be productive. So that's also something that I've recently done with a book published in the 90s, but we can talk about it later. Yeah, because I also agree that this is just of doing such things is of great importance, and it can also help us understand the changes happening to the category of YA. YA, it is a category of books, and it's not solid. It is fluid. It has always been fluid. It has always changed. It keeps on changing, and reevaluating books published in the past. Also, books which were initially published as mainstream adult books and then cross over to YA, or suddenly were marketed as YA. That's also, I think, fascinating. I also like that she in a way, in a very subtle way, criticized the use of toxic masculinity and the crisis of masculinity. I fully agree. I think that talking about crisis different types of crisis is just so counterproductive. I think that it's better to talk about changes and just noticing certain patterns, the need for like discussion, but just positioning an entire group of people as a group of people who are experiencing a crisis is can be so harmful and really can be counterproductive. So thank you for criticizing the use of toxic.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I really appreciate it. Yeah. So I don't think that we have time for more questions, but maybe if there's someone who would really like to ask a question,